How's it going, everyone? Cuppa Anime Joe here. And so we are on a break week right now, which means it felt like a good time to do a discussion video where I just go back over some of the points I made in the review, also touch on some things that I probably missed, and just share some thoughts. In general, this is going to be centered around 1155 and 1156, which are the two most recent chapters and the ones that I've reviewed since coming back to trying this channel. And so I've got some bullet points here behind my camera, just kind of some things I want to go through. And so let's get started. And the first thing here is that Harold cares more about Loki than Loki expects. So this is kind of fair, right? Loki had I would say, atrocious childhood. Blamed for things that were not his fault. Hated by his mother, kind of hated by Elbaf because of the fact that they were blaming him for things that weren't his fault. And then, Harold isn't really around much, right? He travels, so Harold's a great king, but he's not a great father. That's the way I'm going to put it. And so he's out there traveling around, building relationships with these nations, and he's just not at home with his son. And so for starters, I kind of wonder why Harold doesn't just take Loki with him on some of his expeditions. I feel like that could possibly make sense. Maybe not the one where he went to the Holy Land, but I'm sure there are other expeditions that he's gone on, meeting these kingdoms, that it could have benefited Loki to join on. But, he's not around for any of that. And so when Rox asks Loki to contact Harold, he's like, man, even if I try that, he's not going to come. Of course, we all know what happens. Rox hits him with the nut tap. And Harold does actually show up. So, even though Harold is not performing the best as a father because he's serving in such a good capacity as a king, he does care about his son. We actually see this in one of the past chapters. I don't remember which one it is, but we get a small flashback with Harold, Loki, and Hiruden, and he does actually express that he cares about them and that he wants them to get along. So we have kind of seen this, but Loki himself didn't know it. But this carries us into Rock's sword attacks. So the narrator describes his sword attacks as being more akin to a hammer or an explosion like a cannonball, rather than cutting or slicing. And so I wonder if other people might fight like this as well. This brings up a question with Roger and moves like Kamusari. Is Kamusari a pure cutting attack? Or is it also more of an explosive power type move in the same way that Rox fights? So this brings up more questions about different types of sword fights and styles in the story. You got your Mihawks and your Zoros who definitely cut things. They're all about slicing or not slicing if that's what you're going for. But now we have Rox and potentially Roger. We don't know about him for sure, but potentially Roger as well, having these more blunt force, explosive types of sword attacks, And did Oda just do this so Loki didn't get cut in half? Maybe. Or did Oda do this because he really wanted to describe Rox's fighting style as such? I'm willing to bet that it's probably both. And it also makes me curious, let's look at Kaido for a second, who greatly respects Rox as far as we know. He fights with a Kanabo. I believe it's called Hasaikai. All of his attacks are blunt force damage. They're very similar to the way Rox might have fought. He's just using a Kanabo to do it instead of a sword. Right, so we all know Raimei Haken, Thunder Bagura. Pretty cool name for a move. But it just makes me wonder if Kaido was in some way trying to mimic the fighting style of Rox. And going back to Roger really quick in 1156, when he clashes with Garp, Roger takes a fist right to the face. But you see he's like slicing it, kind of, you see the slash going across Garp's midsection, but Garp didn't get cut, right? Did he just tank the slash? Is he using armament hockey on that part of his body and we can't see it? Or is he also taking a blunt force move in the same way that Loki did from Rox? So we'll come back a little bit later to Roger's actual technique, but that little clash with Garp and then the details we learned about Rox make me wonder if maybe Roger has a similar fighting style. Continuing with Rox and his fighting, we get a clash with him and Harold. And this is a clash of conquerors, right? It clears out a 5-kilometer area. We don't see it split the sky, but it split something. Even if the sky wasn't visible for us at the time, or there was no clouds to split, right? And this shows us that Harold really is that guy. He's like practically a Yonko of his era, even if it just didn't quite exist yet. You know, we already know Rox is that guy. So to see Harold clash with him on such an even level, it really shows us that both of them are him. There's just more than one. And so this makes me wonder, like, how strong is Loki? Right? Because Loki is the son of Harold. He is an ancient giant, just like Harold. And we know that all of Elbaf was needed to contain Loki. Well, when I look at Harold clash with Rox, I can envision all of Elbaf being needed to contain Harold as well, if they were to have to do the same thing they did with Loki. And so, like, is Loki in the hammer, is he up to the power level that Harold was at? Or is he even close to that? And so this makes me wonder, right? Even if he turns out to be on our side, will we get to see a clash between him and Emu? Or a clash between him and Luffy? Two people who we know Luffy has Conqueror's Haki. If Emu's a Haki user, I'm going to imagine he has Conqueror's Haki. She has Conqueror's Haki as well. And, you know, this would give us like a current age version of Harold versus Rox, right? Like that clash, you know, maybe with Luffy and Loki, we could see a clash similar in this era, right? And so we know that, like, so because Harold was just using a sword, right? Like a regular sword. So if Loki is that powerful at base, if he really does have the legendary Devil Fruit of Elbaf, either he ate it, people have theorized that his hammer has some kind of ability. Is he even stronger than Harold? So I really think that we should... I mean, and Loki also has a bounty, a special bounty, of somewhere over 2 billion. He's like bordering that Yonko range. So it's probably worth viewing Loki as a Yonko level fighter at this point. It really is, especially if we just use Harold as a basis. And so there's a lot of more Rox in these chapters. I actually made a video all about Rox and the Rox Pirates, which I'll put somewhere up here, over here, somewhere up here. And certainly check that out. I'm not going to elaborate much on it in this video because it's got its own. But yeah, there is a lot of Rox in these last few chapters. So definitely go check that out and let me know what you think. So now we're going to kind of toe back into 1156 here with the Kuja Pirates. So clearly the Kuja Pirates were prevalent in Rox's era and maybe even Roger's era. So I do find it like a bit strange that we've just never heard of this before. I mean, we knew that Shaki used to get chased around by Roger all the time. So that gave us a little bit of hint, although we did not know at the time that Shaki was an Empress of Amazon Lily, because that was Subodi Archipelago when we learned that. And we knew that Gloriosa is part of the Rox crew. Even though she is not there yet in 1156, she is there during the God Valley flashback, which we are leading up to in terms of the timeline in the story. Even if we don't get the God Valley flashback, we haven't reached that part of the story yet, even in the flashback. So, like, we had inklings that the Kuja were somewhat major players in this era, but they were kind of bigger than what we thought. And maybe that's just because Oda didn't want to give too much away of them yet. I've been seeing a lot of theories going around about the chance of Tritoma being Luffy's mom. And as far as I know, the timeline for that lines up. But I'm not so sure if it's the case. Like, I'm kind of leaning away from Tritoma being Luffy's mom, even though it's a good pick of all the different Luffy's mom theories that have been out there. And it's just because we know she died of love sickness, right? So if you if you get with the man that you love, so in the case of Tritoma it would be Dragon, and have a child, even if you then must go back to fulfill being the Empress of Amazon Lily, is she really going to die from love sickness over that? Like, she actually would have achieved the thing to a greater extent than Boa Hancock right now that allows you to survive love sickness, you know? And we know that with the exception of, like, Luffy and I think Rayleigh, you know, men aren't allowed on Amazon Lily. So I don't think that, you know, I don't think that Dragon would have gone to Amazon Lily and had that happen there. You know, I have a feeling that if it was Tritoma, she would have left at some point. And so I don't think it quite lines up. I think it's more likely that Tritoma is just an example that is what traditionally have taken out the Kuja Empresses, unlike Gloriosa, Shaki, and Boa, who all ended up leaving at one point or another to pursue the different love interests. And we get a little bit of a fun triangle here. Roger has the hots for Shaki. Gloriosa has the hots for Roger. And Shaki has the hots for Rayleigh. And we all know who the winners are in the end of this. But spoiler alert, it's Shakuyaku and Rayleigh who come out on top of that triangle there. But yeah, like, the Kuja are very important. You know, maybe Boa just doesn't want to talk about it. Maybe the current Kuja just aren't that interested in sharing that era of their history, especially because they're on good terms with Gloriosa, but they're also not on good terms with Gloriosa. You kind of get the both. You kind of get both of it there. So, you know, it's possible that it's a combination of the current Kuja just not wanting to talk about it and Oda not wanting to reveal too much. I also want to talk about the clash between Roger and Garp. So I really view these two as having almost more of a friendly rivalry. At least I didn't get the sense that they were actually trying to kill each other in this particular clash. And so that makes me think that I don't really think between their entire history they were ever really trying to kill each other, right? Maybe a great comparison would be Dory and Bragi. They were like at odds. They were fighting their 100-year duel, but one of them would have certainly been sad. We saw this. I think it was Dory who got tricked by Mr. 3. It could have been Bragi, but one of them had explosives, I think, put inside of them by Mr. 3. And the other one thought that they killed their friend, right? And so they were very sad. I just am mixing up my details here. But I have a feeling that the same would be true of Roger and Garp. If one of them had actually taken out the other one, I do think there would have been some degree of sadness and remorse there. And at the end of this all, we even see that, you know, Garp is the one that Roger entrusted his son Ace to. So Roger, at the end of his life, trusted Garp enough to raise his child. His child, who, by the way, he was betting on being his successor and the one to bring the dawn of the world. Of course, we know that it's Luffy, but Roger wouldn't have known about that. And in this clash, we get a new sword attack from Roger as well, called Aramitama. So now we have Kamusari, Divine Departure, and Aramitama. And I mentioned this a little earlier, but when I look at his attack and the way that it's hitting Garp, I really think it could be either way. It's possible that it's a slicing attack and Garp tanked it, or that he is similar to Rox and he has more blunt force attacks. And so you could almost view Garp and Roger as like two fists hitting each other, like, just like in the review. Right? But, okay, so what is Ara Mitama? Are we getting a little bit of a theme here with Roger's attacks? So Mitama can be described as the soul of a dead person. When you add the Ara, so you get Ara Mitama, this is more like a rough or wild spirit, sometimes described as the violent side of a person's soul / spirit. So this kind of does fit in line with Roger's attacks, and maybe gives us a hint onto the theme behind the naming, right? Because you got divine departure, heavenly, and then you have Ara Mitama, which is, you know, maybe on the other side of that, but more still in the realm of like divinity and spirits, gods, deities. And so I'm starting to think, you know, we only have 2 named attacks. I'm sure we'll get more from Roger, but I'm starting to think that maybe that is the direction that his named attacks are going to go. Talking about Loki a little bit more, but as a kid, he is still a punk. I guess I can't blame him. Like, when you have Loki's upbringing, what are you going to do? You know, but we're going to focus a little bit more on Ida in this one. But Loki steals a ship, capsizes, almost drowns. Can he not sail? Like, is he like Luffy, where there's just no way he'd make it out on his own? We know that Loki sails later in life, though, so either he has a crew, or he learns how to sail, or maybe he's just already getting too big in childhood as an ancient giant, and the boat he stole is built for regular giants, but it just ain't built for ancient giants. So he might have also capsized it just from being too big. But it's one of those. He was drowning. And of course we know he gets saved by probably the captain of the boat he stole, who then gets chewed out by Ida. And speaking of Ida, like, she is a total sweetheart. While Loki and Hyrule are both against it, Ida genuinely asks Loki why he doesn't just stay with them. So another, like, the 2 questions I had for Loki is, why didn't he just stay with Ida and Hyrule? Because him and Hyrule didn't want to, specifically because Loki didn't want to, but he totally had that choice. Ida absolutely gave it to him. And then, I mean, who knows all the number of things for Harold not bringing Loki with him. Maybe he thought it was the better thing to keep his son out of danger. But really, like, you know, like, Loki says some pretty nasty things to Ida, and she just completely brushes it off. So Harold might be a great king, but Ida is a wonderful mother and parent. Right, who definitely just cares about children in general, no matter their circumstances. Which does make me nervous about her fate, and if she's part of the current story or not. I've heard a lot going around about the chance of Mosa, the counterpart Loki talks about through the Dendenmushi, being Ida. And I do think that would be cool. I'm not sure how I feel on the Mosa theory, because I'm pretty sure that one of the lines that this person tells Loki is that they've never met before. So that could just be a lie. Like, Ida could be keeping up her secret. But Ida and Loki have definitely met before. Like, we see it in 1156. So unfortunately, with the track record of mothers in the story, I am leaning towards Ida no longer being alive in the current storyline, in the current era. But we'll see. That we may even learn that during this flashback with Loki, especially if it goes all the way through to the end of the history of Harold, which it almost has to, because that's literally the question that Hyrule is getting out of Loki. Like, what really happened with our father? What did you really do? What's the real story? So we're surely going to get to see all the way through the end of Harold, which means we may end up getting to see the fate of Ida as well. And the last thing I want to go over is Kyo the Wicked, who we meet in the last chapter, who comes to be Silver Axe, rival of Golden Lion Shiki. And something I didn't notice when I first reviewed the chapter is that when he is walking into Hachinosu and he's got the hood over him, he's like the same size as the people around him. And then he starts getting kicked by the other pirates, and he gets bigger. Suddenly, he's like at least a few heads taller than the rest of them, and his arm's big enough to just grab one of their head skulls entirely. And so, it is very possible that this is just perspective on Oda's part, because a lot of times sizes in One Piece are not consistent in the perspective he gives. But there's also like a non-zero chance that Kyo has the same devil fruit that Urouge now has, which allows him to take in the physical damage that he receives and turn it into power, like getting stronger. And we see with Urouge, however you want to say it, he calls it karmic punishment. He gets bigger, like bigger and bulkier and beefier when he takes damage. And if what we see with Kyo isn't just a perspective thing, then he could very well have that devil fruit, right? Like he's a regular size, and then he takes some physical damage from the pirates around him, and he's able to turn that into more power and a bigger size. So I think there's a decent chance that Kyo is the user of Urouge's devil fruit in that era. And then the last thing again, I talk about a lot of this in the Rocks video I mentioned earlier, but he's got some style. I'll touch on his remodeling. He's the one who blows the eye holes out in the skull on Hachinosu, and that really is what starts giving it the look that we see today. And I do actually love the panel. So much aura, maybe like the Akatsuki level of aura, right? Where you have Rocks and all the main Rocks members' pirates standing behind him, looking out into Hachinosu through the eye holes. So that scene was pretty cool. Great extra layer of introduction to the Rocks pirates. But that's about it. That's what I have for today. Just wanted to try my hand at a little bit of a discussion video to go over some more talking points. I may not do these for every chapter. This is something I've mentioned in some of my last few videos, but this is actually my second channel. My main channel, I guess, shameless self-plug, is called Cup of Science Joe. Very different than what I talk about here. That's an astronomy-themed channel, but I do still dedicate a lot of time to making videos there as well. But for this week, because it's a break week, I definitely wanted to bring a couple things out for you guys and for this channel. And so that's going to be this discussion video and the aforementioned Rocks video. But with that, I will take my leave, and I hope each and every one of you have an excellent rest of your day.